Love is eternal. He had the underside inscribed with, "Love is eternal." It's been many years since he placed this band on my finger, and the letters are worn down, but I can still read them. In many ways, my beloved is, just like this ring, simple, pure, golden, the finest stuff of this earth, and hidden in its circular infinity, an enduring message. Love is eternal. But all that glitters is not gold. For there are those unkind metals that upon first notice appear precious, appear true, but whose luster lies, betrays. My son consists of such material, fool's gold, having placed me here in Bellevue, this wretched asylum, under the falsity of a fabricated charge. Insanity! Insanity! How could a son, loved beyond nature, cared for, exalted, corrupt so wickedly as to treat his mother thus? How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. How sharper still the sting that one should stoop so low as liar, thief, jailer. That monster of mankind, my son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Pardon me. My persecution of a bad son overwhelms my duties of graciousness. And I am advised by Dr. Patterson that remembering myself and my manners may help to hasten my discharge. So, welcome. I am Mary Lincoln, Mrs. President Lincoln. And I am sure that you are as surprised as myself to find the celebrated widow of our nation's martyred savior holding court in Bellevue amongst the inebriate and the deranged. But I find that the world is engorged with surprise, and none other than the fact that in 1875, not the Middle Ages, mind you, that a son can take his mother to court, charge her with insanity, and that she may be convicted without the opportunity to speak in her own defense. That a kangaroo court can rob a woman of her liberty and her property. And not just any woman, your First Lady. Bellevue is a hospital for the insane of the private class, so the quality of my surrounding lunatics is at least top tier. I was raised in a conflicted house. So in these twilight years, whereupon I wearily look forward to lesser days ahead than behind, there is at least symmetry. My childhood years in Lexington, Kentucky were not always unhappy. While my mother was alive, there was considerable joy, but she died when I was 6, shortly after giving birth to my brother George, and left this earth with 2 sons, 5 daughters, and my dear father grieving behind. It was my first real loss, but it was the first loss in a lifetime defined tragically, unceasingly, by loss. My father, Robert Todd, name giver to my disfavored son, married swiftly thereafter, too swiftly, to Betsy Humphreys. Now, she was, in her coldness, spectacularly unsuited to the task of motherhood, though that did not stop her from producing a further 9 offspring in a succession of births and baptisms as to dizzy the clergy. Now, I did not like her, nor was she fond of me. And even though we called this new Mrs. Todd mother, it was truly my elder sister Elizabeth who became more of a parent to me than she. And likewise, my dear old Mammy Sally. Now, this was in the less enlightened years, before my husband's great achievements, before Negro emancipation. And yes, we were a slave-holding family. But our servants never saw cruelty. No, 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 no. We loved our servants. Although I must admit that as a child, sometimes I would succumb to the temptation to commit pranks. And on one occasion, oh dear, well, I slipped a liberal dose of salt in old Mammy Sally's coffee. Ooh, how she spit and gagged, and how she cursed me, calling me the limb of Satan, loping down the broad road leading to destruction. And it wasn't soon after that that I was sent to Madame Mantel's boarding school in an arrangement that I would live at Madame's during weekdays, only to return home at weekend. A relief, I'm sure, to my stepmother's ever-straining nerves, since our large house on Main Street was beginning to overflow with extraneous half-Todds. But this school, this oasis of learning and literature, this became my new home. Over all my years in Lexington were a time when friends were few, but not at Madame's. No, 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 no. There they abounded. And while I was there, I learned to speak French, the purest Parisian. And I acted in French plays. Oh, c'était magnifique. And we would dance while Madame played the fiddle and march in parades. And sometimes we would promenade down the beautiful lilac walk to the estate of Ashland and its statesman, Mr. Henry Clay. Oh, Mr. Clay was handsome, charming, brilliant, my beau ideal of a man. He was called the Western Star, having served as Secretary of State, Senator, and even Speaker of the House for the second Mr. Adams. He was my father's good friend and the pride of Lexington. Oh, I was so smitten. I remember when I was 14, you're going to love this story, I had just turned 14 and I had been given a white pony by father. Well, nothing would have it but that I had to show that white pony to Mr. Clay. So on that pony I hopped and I trotted all the way across town, right up to his front gate until I was stopped by his old black servant. Mr. Clay is entertaining 5 or 6 gentlemen. I love the way he said that. 5 or 6 gentlemen. Well, I told him, I said, you go right back in there and you tell Mr. Clay that Mary Todd wants him to step out here for a moment. Well, off he went, and it wasn't but a few minutes later that here comes Mr. Clay with all his guests. All I could do was just shout out, how do you like my white pony? As spirited as his jockey, he replied. And then he invited me in to dinner with all his guests. Now there, the topic soon turned to my favorite conversation, politics. And I told Mr. Clay how I wished to see him back in Washington as the president. Well, if I do ever become president, Mary Todd will be amongst my first guests. Will you come? Well, of course I said yes. And in the excitement of the moment, I just blurted out, if you were not already married, I would wait for you. Oh, well, then all the men just started to laugh, and 14-year-old Mary Todd did not like to be laughed at. So soon after dinner, I humbly dismissed myself, and I blushingly returned back home. Oh, but that evening, that moment, that invitation to the White House, well, now, it was something I never would forget. That I had been invited there, that I belonged there. Well, now my husband belonged there. I simply belonged with him. Well, I moved from Lexington in 1839 to live with my sister Elizabeth and her new husband, Ninian Edward, in Springfield, Illinois. I did meet Mr. Lincoln in the fall of that year at a cotillion that he had helped to organize. Now, I was certainly aware of him. My cousin, John Todd Stewart, and he were law partners, so I had seen him, known of him. And to be quite charitable, he was more than usually plain. But in him, there was something remarkable, something special for which I was uniquely aware. Oh, his kindness and his humor, of course, but even more importantly, his potential. I remember he approached me from across the room, towering above all the other guests. "Miss Todd," he said in his sweetest, most nervous tenor, "I want to dance with you the worst way." And he certainly did. Why, to say he had two left feet would slander left feet. What was that dance we shared? Was it the polka, perhaps? Da 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 da. No. That song reminds me of Willie, our precious boy. We lost 3 of our sons, you know. First Eddie, years ago, back in Springfield, he was only 4 years old. And then Tad, just a few years ago, at 18. And Willie, while we were in the White House. We loved all of our children, of course, but Willie, oh, Willie was the best of both of us, of his father and of me. He was, oh, I wish I could forget myself. Mr. Lincoln and I were like stars in a constellation of friends pulling us into orbit ever closer to one another. We, exemplars of Springfield society, called ourselves the Coterie. And I shared something of an equal understanding with these gentlemen. So even and so fair were their consideration of my observations. I had so much education for a young woman of my age and a political imagination every bit as acute and as ambitious as their own. Oh, and now, besides Mr. Lincoln, there were other suitors. I believe you know one of them, Mr. Stephen Douglas. Mr. Stephen Douglas. Oh, our interests were entirely sympathetic, despite his being the most abominable of all political animals, a Democrat. But I always knew that at his highest ambitions, he would always come up short. No pun intended, I assure you, but the little giant, Mr. Douglas, could never equal my tall Kentuckian. He did ask for my hand, but I told him, I shall not consent to be your wife. I shall be Mrs. President, or I am the victim of false prophets, but it shall not be as Mrs. Douglas. Now, little did I know then, and how could I, that at his highest ambitions, he would climb all the way up to the candidacy for president, and it would be my husband who would spell his defeat, So yes, they were rivals for more than merely my hand. And in that famous race of 1860, that election had 4 candidates, but for me, it was an election about 2 old friends, 2 old suitors. And once again, my poor unsuccessful Mr. Douglas came up short. 500,000 votes short. But as my husband stepped forward to deliver his magnificent inaugural address, appealing to the better angels of our nature, so too did Mr. Douglas step forward to accept my distinctive, or shall I say Mr. President's distinctive hat. Mr. Douglas said if he could not be president, he would be the president's hat bearer. And he was not without consolation, of course. He finally did win my hand around his arm at the inaugural ball. But alas, a deeper, bitterer rivalry had by then begun, as Mr. Jefferson Davis was already elected president of that illegitimate Confederacy. And the winds of civil war whipped through our great land and spread flame. Our idol, our great compromiser, Mr. Henry Clay, had done his best to try to keep this country together, but it had crumbled under the single unsuccessful term of President Buchanan. The issue of slavery, which my husband always thought to be a great evil, had exploded, and North and South were parted like Moses' Red Sea. When my husband took office, it was up to him to either pull this country together or tear it apart entirely. My husband believed in the Union, so when we set out from Springfield to Washington, we were on a path to save it. Now, what we found in Washington was dilapidation. I think the great author, Mr. Charles Dickens, put it best when he visited Washington. He wrote, "It was a magnificent city with magnificent intentions, with spacious avenues that started in nothing and led nowhere." And our home, the White House, that mansion, that great cathedral upon which the protector of our great nation sits, did not show strength. Why, it was seedy. My husband's secretary, William Stoddard, said it looked like an old unsuccessful hotel. Well, I was not about to let my husband, my country, be represented by some crumbling old inn. The carpets worn, the wallpaper peeling, and the furniture so deplorably shabby it looked like it hadn't been replaced for some 75 years since the first Mr. Adams. Miss Harriet Lane, niece to Mr. Buchanan, had acted as hostess for her unmarried uncle while he was in the office, and she had done her best to maintain appearances. They called her the Democratic Queen. Well, now, the crown had passed, and the Republican Queen had arrived. Now, I must admit that I was ever vigilant about the perceptions of Mr. Lincoln and I as provincial, as vulgar Westerners, so what sophistication the White House lacked, I purchased. At Howell's in New York City, I bought the most beautiful dining room service. I brought in Dorflinger's cut glassware from Zimondi's in Washington. I had the gold flatware replated, the mirrors replaced and re-gilded. I had the floors refinished, the walls refurbished, and new carpet laid. The effect, transformation. An over-budget transformation. They allotted us $20,000. Well, we spent more than that amount. But luckily for me, I had friends and allies who creatively tucked bills and invoices into congressional appropriations. I had enemies too, the socialites and the vampire press. They denounced my refurbishings as extravagance while soldiers suffered in the fields. My husband dismissed my refurnishings as flubadubs. But I knew I knew that we had to not only be strong, we had to appear strong. Why, when Prince Bonaparte came over from France in August of 1861, we knew they would inspect the Confederacy as well, but it was the Union who dazzled them. And while all the socialites and the cabineers and the senators and journalists all scrambled to try to communicate with our foreign guest, it was I who engaged him. I put him at ease. I charmed him. I spoke French. Les appearances sont importantes. Appearances are important. And yet I was vilified. I was called coarse, vain, unamiable, and wasteful as war raged. But it was I who raised money for the military hospitals. I gave $1,000 for oranges and lemons to ward off scurvy. And I sat for so many grievous hours with our ailing and dying soldiers that they gave me a commendation. So to suggest that I was insensitive to our soldiers, well, now that was a slander that I cannot and will not accept. I knew sacrifice. My own family. You may think that the relations of the president of his wife would naturally automatically side with him or her, but for every Union Todd, there was a traitor, a turncoat, a Confederate. Why, my own brother Sam and Alec died in battles in 1861 fighting against us. Well, never mind, I do not mourn their deaths. They made their choices years ago, and since they chose to be our bitter enemies, I do not mourn them. But I knew sacrifice. And it was a house divided. And it was an unhappy season, for all families were divided. The bloodiest battles in the history. And the conflict's toll on families was absolute, inescapable. We all knew sacrifice. And then the war was almost over in 1865, April 9th, with the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox. We were jubilant. So many years of senseless bloodshed. I remember we planned to go to the theater a few days later. We were going to see a comedy with a young couple, the Harrises. It was a new comedy, Our American Cousin. I can remember on the carriage ride over, my husband was so happy that I said to him, "Husband, you startled me with your cheerfulness." And he looked at me and he said, "Mother, we must both be more cheerful. What with the war and with losing our dear Willie, we have been miserable." So I smiled. It was April 14th, Good Friday. When we walked into the theater, everyone stood and cheered while the band struck up "Hail to the Chief." And in the third act, my husband reached out for my hand. And I leaned into him and I said, "Now, husband, what would Miss Harris think of my clinging to you so?" And he said, "She won't think anything about it." And then the world ended in a small explosion of gunpowder. I screamed, "The president is shot! The president is shot!" And then pandemonium. The assassin jumped down to the stage, turned around, screamed something, and vanished. And there were screams all about. A doctor appeared. "Oh, doctor, do something for him, please. They carried him across the street to a house, and they laid him in a bed diagonally because he was so very tall. They brought Robert to me. He wept. I wept. Men, soldiers who had seen the horrors of war with unimpeachable stoic valor, they wept. Why didn't he take me when he was called from my side? Why didn't he shoot me? Oh, love. Oh, speak to me one more time before you go. Speak to our children. Dad, where's Daddy? He'll speak to Daddy. He loved him so. He loved us so. But his head drooped to his chest, and his eyes closed, and his soul flew then. My husband's Secretary of War articulated that all was over. He's with the angels now. And while my husband's soul flew to the highest reaches of heaven, I was bowed to the earth with sorrow. The next few weeks were a blur. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. And while Tad and Robert and I sat in darkness, vandals ransacked the White House for souvenirs.
Heather goes to round, please. Heather goes to round, then.
China, candlesticks, scraps of curtains removing from its hallowed halls and walls all its glory, all evidence of my work, my contributions. The appearance of strength, I suppose, that vanished with my sainted husband. 40 days after that dark day, we left our home in tatters. And that's the state in which you see me now, stripped of all liberty, of property, of family, of reputation, slandered as a lunatic. And all those years of imploring Congress for a pension, all for naught, for as Robert controls my liberty, so too does he control my properties as well. Oh, I'm sure you read about it in the papers, the spectacle, the trial, where men who do not know me, one by one, gave testament to my alleged derangements. Their evidence laughable, that I came home from a visit in Florida, hysterical over my dear son's Robert's illness. Now I have dreamt and foreseen the deaths of 3 of my sons. What manner of mother would I be had I not come to my son's side immediately? They allege that I made wild purchases, bought things that I did not need, gowns, jewelry, finery. Well, now, who is to say what I need and what I don't need? An aggrieved widow, a childless mother may need things because gowns and jewelry and gloves and curtains and footstools and whatever, they do not leave me. They alleged I spoke to phantoms, that I saw my 3 dead sons and my dead husband, and that I spoke to them. Well, it is true that in prior years I dabbled in the trade of the spiritualist, their seances and their conjuring of voices. But I would not care to live a day without the beautiful and consoling belief that our loved ones who reside in heaven may enter our midst, witness our grief and our suffering, and console us with their invisible presence. When you have lived as I so long in the light, who could be blamed for occasionally clinging to shadows? I was not allowed to speak at my trial. My attorney, if such he may be called, gave a half-hearted defense, and the jury, not of my peers, I assure you, weighed my sanity a whole 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Now, if I were insane, wouldn't it immediately be recognized? Wouldn't it instantly be known? If I had had the opportunity to speak at my trial, I might have asked, was it not a miracle that I was not more distraught, unnerved? Who would call insane a woman who had put into the ground mother, father, brothers, countrymen, their blood shed in senseless battle, 3 sons gone before her, and husband, saint, a man God saw fit to give this unworthy nation, all gone, all buried, and only 2 witnesses, 2, an aggrieved widow and an ungrateful child. Oh, Robert, to think that my own son would do this to me. Oh, Bellevue is not altogether unpleasant. Dr. Patterson annoys, but he does me no real harm. And my friends, Judge James Bradwell and his wife Myra, solicit for my liberty. They've already stirred up the papers. All the vampire press that hated me so many years ago are starting to feel glints of sympathy for me now. So soon I shall be free. Just as my husband emancipated a people, so too shall I be free. So I will leave Bellevue soon. Soon, I think. Soon. So you see, love is eternal. The poet, Mr. Walt Whitman, have you heard of him? He was fond of my husband, and upon his death he wrote a poem for him. Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearless trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. And the prize he sought is won. A people freed, a nation united, and a family loved beyond nature. I shall have to write Mr. Whitman and thank him for such kind words about my husband. And I only hope that when the Lord sees fit to call me home, that I will be remembered for some small act of kindness. I shall be remembered. Exalt, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain walks, fallen cold and dead. Da-da-da.